Georgia, where East meets West. Tamerlane. Part 3. In 1399, after invading Kakheti, Tamerlane withdrew to the Karabakh camp, where his troops spent the winter, supplied with provisions from the campaign. According to his Persian chronicler, the spring breeze blew from the grass-covered haven. Tamerlane called a council of noyans and hard commanders to plan another campaign against Georgia. Each soldier received a horse, supplies, and rewards for their service. The massive horde then set out toward Georgia. The horde had never been stronger than it was at this time. It was the spring of 1400. Tamerlane believed he could easily conquer Georgia, expecting that this Christian state, already weakened by conflict, would finally submit to Islam. If successful, he could expand his vast empire even further. This was the first time such a massive army had gathered at the gates of the Georgian state. Tamerlane was unlike any enemy Georgia had faced before. The enemy's numbers are beyond counting. King Lang awaits your response. Few rulers in our history have faced such a challenge as George VII. Tamerlane demanded total submission, saying, "I am your ruler, present yourself before me." He also demanded that Tahir Jalaya, the Tabriz ruler's heir, be handed over to him, after being freed from Ilinja fortress. King George responded firmly. The Bagrati-Oni dynasty does not betray those under its protection. Armies were gathered from Sinakar, Khorasan, China, Afghanistan, Komakan, and Mawaranar. Submitting to Tamerlane would mean the collapse of Georgia, which was at that time a symbol of resistance against him. King George faced two options: surrender, which meant renouncing Christianity and the Georgian identity, or fight an unequal war for survival, sacrificing much against overwhelming odds. Surrender would lead to Georgian lands being taken over by nomadic tribes, the destruction of Georgian culture, and the loss of their identity. King George accepted the challenge with dignity. When Tamerlane's vizier presented the overwhelming forces, George replied, "Tell the cripple Timur, I am no lesser king. He cannot destroy my country." If he has harmed us, he has not escaped unharmed himself. Let the sword decide between us. The reaction of an enraged Tamerlan was recorded by his chronicler Sharaf ad-Din. The fierce flame of his majesty grew even stronger because of that defiant George, and he ordered his mighty army to invade Georgia, to wage a holy war against the most wicked and faithless enemy, to destroy the people, and lay waste to the fields and orchards. King George hid his people in remote mountainous areas and forests. Tamerlane advanced, and King George also prepared his forces. The king gathered warriors from the Dariali Gorge, Transcaucasia, and the North Caucasus. Both sides clashed, resulting in a fierce battle. Strong winds blew dust into the faces of Tamerlane's warriors. The Georgians, emboldened, attacked the enemy with ferocity. Ultimately, they managed to defeat the horde. King George knew that it was impossible to achieve complete victory against such a powerful enemy. His strategy was to weaken the enemy and demonstrate that Georgia would not surrender. Today, George VII is often criticized for choosing resistance over compromise with Tamerlane. These views are shaped by the context of today, 6 centuries after these events. During those 600 years, Georgia fought against numerous enemies, including neighboring empires and nomadic invaders. Every generation faced significant losses during these struggles. For the last 200 years, Georgia was part of a foreign empire. As a result, the collective mindset of the Georgian people weakened. The modern Georgian mindset is quite different from that of Georgians during George VII's time. George VII, the great-grandson of George the Brilliant, ruled a strong state, supported by the military power of North Caucasian allies. A generation accustomed to freedom, raised in a strong state, could not accept losing their land and faith. They were willing to die for their homeland. Ibn Arabsha, a historian known for his objectivity, described Georgia at that time. Their kingdom is small, but it is fortified with castles, towers, mountains, gorges, ravines, and cliffs. Conquering it is difficult due to the combination of their noble spirit and natural defenses. Georgia, with its limited land, did not have the option to draw enemies deep into its territory to weaken them over time. Instead, Georgian defensive tactics were adapted to the mountainous terrain. The Georgians skillfully used mountain passes and narrow gorges, launching surprise attacks to destroy the enemy. During battles at many fortresses, the enemy suffered heavy losses. King George chose a deliberate strategy of tactical retreat. The intensity of the Georgian defense led Lang's historians to compare the battles in small Gurjistan to the conquest of vast India, which Tamerlane had conquered in just 1 year. The enemy entered Lower Kartli and fought at each fortress before advancing to Tbilisi. Despite fierce defense, Tbilisi eventually fell due to complete exhaustion. Lang stationed selected Khwarezmian warriors in the city, while he pursued the Georgian forces toward Gori. After destroying towers and fortresses, Tamerlane sought to deceive the Georgians. Persian sources mention Berdiashvili, a traitor who led the enemy into the Ksoni Gorge. The Largvisi monastery chronicler narrates the battle. The king's loyal ally, Gvenifnol's Vershel Aristavi, hid the local people in secure locations. He left his warriors' families and his own family in the no-go tower, while he himself took position in the Bekushi fortress. When the enemy entered the gorge and reached Largvisi, they were ambushed by Vershel Aristavi. The Ksonis systematically destroyed the enemy forces in the gorge until they drove them out completely. Realizing he was powerless in the mountains, Lang moved towards Samtavisi. This area was home to the estates of the Umilokvari family's ancestors, the Zedginidze. Yonibeg Zedginidze led the defense of Inner Kartli's fortresses until ultimately being captured by Tamerlane. Sources mention the Muslim prisoners whom Tamerlane liberated. These prisoners had been captured by King George during a raid on Nakhichevan. After the battle in Kartli, Lang advanced toward Gori Castle. Sharaf ad-Din described Gori as a fortress as strong as a lover's oath. Despite heavy losses, Tamerlane captured the fortress and sent his commanders to pursue the Georgian king. Tamerlane used every method available. He even managed to capture part of the king's retinue. However, Lang's efforts were in vain. Loyal Georgians preferred death over betrayal. Persian chroniclers, trying to please Lang, wrote, "George, king of Georgia, roamed the dense forests like a wounded tiger." King George led guerrilla warfare, setting traps for the enemy throughout the region. In the devastated fields of Kartli, Tamerlane sought to destroy all churches and places of worship. His soldiers demolished large churches to their foundations, razing all buildings on Georgian soil. Many rocky shelters found today in Georgia are believed to have been built during this period. The local population sought refuge in these shelters. Persian sources praised Tamerlane's warriors for their efforts in locating those hiding. The same sources also describe the brutal treatment of the Georgians. Some were killed, others taken captive. Thomas of Metsup, an Armenian chronicler who witnessed the deportation of Georgian captives, wrote, "We saw the Christian captives, heard their cries, yet we were powerless to assist. The Georgians, once the source of our pride against the Muslims, had no time for us."
ვისითაც სომხები მაჰმადიანთა წინაშე თავს ვიწონებდით, ახლა ჩვენთვის აღარ ცალიათ.
Dizama fortress became a refuge for King George, from which his warriors launched attacks against Timur's horde. Sharaf ad-Din wrote about the fortress's strength. So strong was its defense that clouds reaching its base caused sweat to bead on its brow. Eventually, Tamerlane discovered George's location and surrounded Dizama fortress. The defenders fought fiercely, throwing boulders down upon the attackers. Abdal-Razak of Samarkand noted that Tamerlane's forces had to prepare themselves carefully, and even Tamerlane himself had to lead the assault. Inside the fortress there were two formidable enemies, King George and Prince Tahir of Tabriz. After a long siege, the fortress fell. However, King George managed to escape with Jalaya to the Savaneti fortress. In the Dizama gorge, Tamerlane's forces targeted monasteries and the local population. They gathered people in one place, trying to force them to renounce Christianity. The captives chose martyrdom over renouncing their faith. Sharaf ad-Din wrote, "In the name of Sharia law, so much blood was shed that the earth turned crimson. A mountain of corpses piled up, and rivers of blood flowed from its slopes. Many towns and villages were never rebuilt after Tamerlane's invasion. To this day, the region remains devoid of castles or settlements. Only the name remains, the Savaneti settlement. During this time, battles continued for the Savaneti fortress, and after its fall, King George moved to western Georgia. Tamerlane did not dare attack Imereti, and after crossing Kvishketi, turned his forces toward Meskheti. During the battle, Kutsna Emir-Ajibi, a notable warrior and public figure, encountered Tamerlane and struck him with a sword. Although he could not decapitate Lang, Emir-Ajibi managed to take Tamerlane's iron helmet and presented it as an offering at St. George's Church in Ratcha, western Georgia. Tamerlane caused extensive damage in Meskheti, leaving a trail of innocent casualties, desecrated churches, and stolen relics. Ivan Otabogi could not resist his forces and took refuge in a fortress. After the invasion of Meskheti, Tamerlane moved to Trialeti, destroying the Rukoni monastery along the way. An inscription on a small wall reads, "Tamerlane came to these lands and defiled churches and monasteries." The Kvotakevi monastery suffered a similar fate. After looting it, Lang gathered the monks and nuns and burned them alive. To this day, traces of those tragic events remain visible. 6 centuries later, the monastery stands again, and services are still held there. Georgians continue to be baptized here. No Muslim ruler, before or after, dared to desecrate Svetitsko Valley. Yet Tamerlane destroyed its dome and looted the patriarchal cathedral. From Skita, Tamerlane moved into the Aragvi Gorge, where he met fierce resistance from the Highlanders. He could not take any captives. After his failed incursion, he retreated southward, launching a campaign in Dao before camping in the Kola field. Despite his destructive campaigns, Tamerlane realized he could not crush Georgian resistance. Confronted with the threat of complete annihilation, the Georgians fought a desperate war for survival. Continue history of Georgia. Georgia, where East meets West. To be continued.
you.